Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to give everyone a minute or two to join us today. So feel free to go grab a snack, grab some water, and we'll get started in just a minute or two here. All right. For those of you just joining us, we'll get started in another minute or two. But welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. Feel free to go to the chat. Let us know what institution you're at, where you're joining us from today. Always love to see, where across the country and across the world people are joining us from. All right, snowy Minnesota. Yes, those winter storms are really getting us. Welcome, Leah from TCU. So happy you're here and joining us. Awesome. Looks like we have a couple of other folks joining us in the chat here. University of St. Mary of the Lake, welcome. Sarah from Maryland. I'm here in Washington, D.C., so your neighbor, not too far away. All right. Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone, for letting us know where you're from. LSU, Brazil. Yeah, folks all over the place. We love to see it. All right. Well, it seems like we have a pretty good group here, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Really excited for our conversation today about optimizing space on campus and really empowering your events team. Want to kick off today's session with just a quick round of introductions. So, hi everyone. My name is Bridget Moran. I'm our content manager here at CourseDog, so really focused on all things research and content related. I spent a lot of the past few months really diving into the events and space management space. So, really excited to be talking with you today. And I'll hand it over to Brian now to introduce himself.
Thanks, Bridget. Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Smith. I'm a product manager at CourseDog, and I focus primarily on our events management tools. So I spend a lot of time thinking about events and talking with folks about how they're managing events and how we can help them make things easier. So I'm looking forward to chatting with everyone today.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Great. Well, before we dive in, I want to quickly provide everyone an overview with what we're going to be talking about today. So first, we'll start off by talking about why campus space is really only getting more important. We know that the events team and others that manage space on campus really play a key role as a partner, a revenue driver, and much more on campus. Then we'll talk about how space is currently managed and what are some of the challenges that folks might be currently experiencing that comes with those practices. And finally, we'll discuss some of the practices that you can implement on your campus to help make better use of your space, get the data you need, and better partner with other units. We'll also walk through a template for how to communicate and make the case for space investments to leaders on your campus. Also note that we're going to conduct a few polls throughout today's session, so really looking forward to getting everyone's perspective on this topic and learn about how you're approaching this on your campus. And one final thing before we dive in, I know a lot of people ask, will I be able to see the recording or the deck afterwards? Yes, we will be sending that out to everyone. So within the next day or so, you'll be getting an email with a link to both the recording and the deck, so you'll have that for your reference. So with all of that being said, let's go ahead and dive in. So I'm guessing everyone wouldn't be here today if they didn't think that campus space was important, but I really want to set the stage for our discussion today and briefly talk about why space is becoming even more important. We'll talk about the critical role that your events team plays in all of this, and we'll also talk about why space needs are growing more complex. I think the quote on this slide by Dr. Gonzalez nicely sums up how many of us feel about space on campus. He notes that it's not only a prized resource, but also subject to all sorts of opinions. Everyone has different ideas about how space can best be used or who owns it. So I think if we can better understand how campus space is used, be better stewards of it, and really learn how to use it more strategically, that's definitely a worthwhile effort. While many parties on campus are involved in space management and use, I want to touch on the importance of an institution's events team and the impact that they have. These teams often do a lot of behind the scenes work, and their work really has a huge impact on campus and how space is used. If you look at all of the work the events team does, they're really a partner across campus. They work with students, faculty, and staff to facilitate events. And in order to run those events successfully, they partner with multiple units across campus, including dining services, campus safety, parking, facilities, really you name it, they've probably worked with them. Managing and hosting events also helps to meet a number of institutional objectives. For example, renting out space to external parties can bring in revenue for the institution. This additional revenue helps meet institutional needs, such as perhaps upgrading spaces. Equally as important, hosting campus events helps drive student engagement. Events give students a space to connect with other students, faculty, and staff on campus. These events also help students build relationships and a sense of belonging within the community. And we all know how critical this is for student well-being as well as retention. All of this ties into the final quadrant of the slide here, the events team as a goal contributor. Effectively managing space and hosting events helps to meet institutional objectives. Some goals may be related directly to space use, such as being a good steward of campus resources, both financially and sustainably. As I mentioned, other goals might relate to student and community engagement that tie into broader enrollment targets. So clearly, I think it's pretty obvious there's a lot that's tied to campus space. However, I'm sure I don't have to tell most of you that space is a finite resource. For many institutions, acquiring new space just really isn't an option, or building new space is prohibitively expensive. According to analysis by one construction firm, they found that on average, it costs $600 for every square foot of campus construction in the US. With tight finances and soaring costs, this isn't a realistic option for most campuses. However, the problem of space is even more complicated when you look at the many demands that institutions are facing. Especially as pandemic restrictions have been easing, there's a new demand for spaces that can facilitate meaningful in-person interactions. We also know that many campus spaces that perhaps do or maybe don't meet sustainability goals that you all have. And as we just talked about in the previous slide, there are also opportunities to rent out space to generate revenue. How can institutions rent out space more frequently when it isn't in use? And how can we ensure that these space rentals align and further the institutional mission? And finally, institutions are asking how space can be better used to meet academic needs. How can space be optimized so additional high demand sections can be offered? Offering more sections of high demand courses can help keep students on track and can help bring in that additional tuition revenue. And I'm sure, of course, there are probably other demands that you all are facing that we haven't even covered on this slide here. So on that note, would love to launch into our first poll here and get all of your perspectives and hear where you're really experiencing the most urgency when it comes to space on your campus. So let's go ahead and launch that poll now. We'll leave it open for about 60 seconds or so. So feel free to take your time here. And if there's something that we haven't covered here, please feel free to take to the chat and add that in. Right, seeing some responses rolling in here. We'll leave it open for just a little while longer for anyone that hasn't had a chance to select their answers here. All right, let's give it about another 10 seconds and then we can go ahead and close the poll and share the results for everyone to see. All right, this is pretty interesting here. So it looks like the top response by far is demand for certain spaces are increasing, whether that's collaborative, technology enabled. If we miss something here, if you have a specific example, we'd love to hear about that if you want to type that into the chat. But yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially after, a year or two away from campus. Everyone's really excited to see each other. I know I am. So that makes sense that, we want to make sure that we're really facilitating those meaningful interactions. Yeah, after that, it looks like, everyone is interested in these other options here. Looks like particularly, efficiency and sustainability, that's a big one. Always great to see that. Brian, do you have any thoughts here about these poll results?
Yeah, it's definitely really interesting. I think it's cool to see that a lot of the other options are pretty close there. I think they're all pretty closely linked, especially if we're thinking about increasing efficiency. A lot of things fall into that, like renting out more space, opening up more space for student events. So definitely hear from a lot of folks that a lot of these pressures are linked and they're thinking about all of them. So that makes a lot of sense to see.
Absolutely. Well, I'll go ahead and toss it over to you here, Brian.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Bridget. So I want to talk here a little bit about the current state of space management, and touch on a couple of different things like the drawbacks of using multiple systems, some of the challenges that present themselves with tracking space use and metrics, and then also touch on some of the financial impacts of poor space management or some of this really complex space management that can come up when folks are using multiple systems at one time. So the first thing we'll touch on is multiple systems making life really hard for administrators and just kind of causing ripple effects across campus when information is living in a bunch of different systems. So you'll see on the slide here, especially when we have academic and non-academic events tracked in different places, there can be a lot of downstream impacts from that. It's unclear who is where at any given time. There's a lot of manual work required to translate and coordinate between the different systems, which can lead to mistakes, confusion, and then a really big mess when we're looking at trying to actually track that data. And just to give some more concrete examples here, this can lead to things where campus security, for example, maybe is looking at a schedule that might be out of sync because some scheduling management happens in one place and academic room management happens in another, and maybe there's not really clear attendance data on who is in one place versus who is in another place, and that can sometimes pose a problem for campus security. We also, might have cases where one piece of data lives in one system and another piece of data lives in another system, and maybe facilities doesn't get the memo or the work order that they were supposed to get about setting up spaces. So, as you can imagine, as a lot of you probably experience day to day, this can cause a lot of downstream ripple effects when we have different data in different systems and are trying to keep everything aligned. And then we also are pretty interested in talking about, do you really know how your space is used? Kind of touching on that last slide with having different data in different systems, that can make it really hard to answer some of the pressing questions that you all are probably looking to answer about space utilization. Which types of spaces are most in demand? Which times are most in demand? Who are our biggest users and who are our fastest growing users? Those are just some really common questions that we hear from customers about questions they're looking to answer. And then, on the right here are just some resource metrics that kind of go along with answering those questions, from which spaces need to be cleaned, how can we use space more sustainably, how are our resources being used, and when do rooms need to be locked or unlocked. And this can connect to a lot of different parts of, campus finances and campus life, everything from, HVAC systems and turning lights on and off to making sure buildings are secure, which goes along with that last question. So, if we don't have the right space utilization metrics, it makes it really hard for us to answer some questions about how we need to allocate resources and how we can actually make things work more efficiently on campus. And on that note, we are on to our second poll here. And I'm really curious to learn about the metrics that you all are already using, but also the metrics you would, maybe like to have better access to if you could. So we've already started the second poll here. And just like last time, if everyone wants to take maybe 60 seconds to go ahead and respond to which metrics you're currently struggling to collect, but would like to have better access to. Really curious to hear what you all think, and we can chat a little bit more about that when we wrap up the poll in about a minute. And feel free to use the chat if there's something that's been on your mind that's not on the poll response, or just as we're moving ahead, definitely feel free to throw questions or comments in the chat as well.
Awesome. Well, it looks like, yeah, good number of responses, and here are the results.
Awesome. So two clear leaders here. When spaces are empty and underutilized, and the biggest and fastest growing space users, which is really interesting. Definitely huge concern is making sure that we don't have a lot of empty spaces, and trying to find ways to maybe shift some events to those spaces and kind of ease the burden on really heavily used spaces, and then understanding who actually is requesting spaces more often, whether it's specific groups on campus that are maybe growing, or some more external events, which we'll talk a little bit more about later.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this is fascinating. I think another one that jumps out at me here is, what resources are being used at any given time or for any event. I imagine most of you are probably dealing with storage closets full of, tables, chairs, other pieces of equipment, and knowing, oh, if there's a last minute event that comes up, do we actually have the number of chairs to support this event? I think those are questions that folks are asking frequently, so it makes a lot of sense that, you would want the data for that. Great. Well, let's go ahead and move into our next slide here. I think that, Brian has already briefly touched on this, but we know that tracking space metrics isn't just interesting from a data perspective, but it can also really have a real impact on the bottom line. I think perhaps the best example of this is what happens when space isn't used efficiently and rooms sit empty due to poor usage. Again, one of the top poll results we just looked at. If that space use was optimized, then institutions would perhaps be able to use that available space to offer additional sections of high demand courses. If students aren't able to access the courses they need, this prevents them from progressing to their degree, or perhaps even in a worst case scenario, even graduating. I think this is super fascinating, and we actually just wrapped up a student survey in conjunction with College Pulse that touched on this very subject. The report is forthcoming and should be out in the next month or so, but the first survey found that about 1 in 5 students said that they would actually stop attending their current school if they weren't able to enroll in the classes they need. And this is really pretty staggering when you think about it, and potentially the massive impact that this could have on tuition revenue. In the middle of the slide, you'll see we highlighted an inability to track space use and how that hampers institutions from understanding when space could be rented out to external parties for revenue or used for other cases. And finally, inefficient space utilization can lead to increased expenses when it comes to perhaps your facilities or energy resources not being used efficiently, which again ties back to those sustainability goals that you all mentioned was important for you. So we just spent the past few minutes talking about some of the challenges that come, with current space management practices, but want to spend the next section here talking about some practices you can all implement to really streamline that space management process. Understand those utilization patterns, and then of course also maximize those space rentals as well. Earlier, Brian touched on some of the issues that are associated when it comes to using multiple systems to manage your space and events. Centralizing all of your bookings, both academic and non-academic, addresses these issues and provides benefits across campus. First off, using one system eliminates any confusion over what system needs to be used to book a certain type of event. No more navigating between multiple systems, emails, spreadsheets, or in some cases, maybe even paper forms. This also allows users to see and request all the information they need in one place. A centralized system should allow users to see space features, capacity, and maybe even floor plans where applicable. Users should also be able to indicate what resources they'll need, such as the number of chairs, tables, or AV equipment. Centralizing all this information has a couple of different benefits. First, it provides transparency around room availability and the status of outstanding requests. This isn't only helpful for staff who are managing those space requests, but also for others on campus. A centralized system can support a singular calendar that informs students and others of what's going on campus. And finally, one system prevents double bookings and other errors that occur when users have to navigate multiple systems and manually input that information. All right, I want to touch on a couple of other benefits that we didn't get to on the previous slide when it comes to using that one system for all of your space bookings. Using one system allows campuses to standardize and simplify space request forms. Request forms should be electronically accessible and allow users to request resources and equipment they need for space use. It should also enable users to see the status of their request. No need for them to email or call the events team or another space team to check on the status and find out if that they've even received the request and how far along they are in processing it. As a best practice, we typically recommend standardizing space forms and making them as simple as possible. But we know that there also might be times where you need to make small variations depending on the type of requests. Specifically, there might be times it makes sense to add certain questions to make sure that the requester has really thought out their request before submitting it. I'm sure for anyone here that has sat on a space committee before, it can be quite overwhelming to sort through a multitude of requests that may not contain all the information that you need. To encourage well thought out requests, it might make sense to ask requesting parties about their unit space inventory. What's the status of their inventory, and have they attempted to find any room in that allocation? Is there an urgent request, and has a dean or unit leader approved it? And what are the consequences if the request is denied? These types of questions can help cut down on the number of requests and ensure that folks who are reviewing the requests actually have all the information they need. And I will toss it over to Brian now.
Yeah, awesome. So just taking it a little further from what Bridget just covered, I want to talk about equipping teams with self-service reports. So on that idea of kind of making things really easy for requesters and making things really easy for our own teams to manage, a really great best practice here is to make sure that we have the reports that we need, not only to kind of report generally on things like space utilization, which spaces are being utilized the most, which organizations are requesting the most space, but also to do things like identifying conflicts, create a list of setup and tear down times so that we can share that with facilities or campus security and make sure that rooms are open, things are set up, resources are put in the right place. Listing all events with those resources. So that kind of overlaps with setup, tear down, facilities, just making sure that any group that owns a resource or owns a space know when it needs to be ready, knows what needs to be there, and can actually put the correct preparations and items into place for that event to take place. And then we just, going back to who is actually using these spaces, who are the people we need to loop in on the organization side to make sure they're reminded. Those are just some of the essential reports that are kind of required for an events team and a facilities team to function and make sure that all of the data that's coming from one single source of truth can kind of be reported on consistently. And then it's also really valuable to be able to filter things, not just have kind of one monolithic report, but to be able to drill down into the data a little bit, focus on specific dates, focus on specific event types or locations. Again, going back to, ownership of specific rooms or resources, it can be really unhelpful sometimes to share, a list of events for a week when there's 400 things going on, when one department or one team, or maybe, the catering unit or the AV unit only needs to know about events in one building or with one specific resource type, or, if it's broken down by event type and the event type is a screening or an event type that includes food, can be really helpful to drill down a little bit further and give specific teams the actual data they need. And then it's also great to be able to filter by the status of an event, whether it's pending, whether it's been approved, what do we have outstanding that we need to go back and review and make sure that we're prepared to actually host that event. These are all of, some of the really important filters. This is all stuff that can, that we think a lot about at CourseDog, all with an eye towards making things really easy for individual teams and making sure that people have the data and the reports they actually need to do their job and make event management run really smoothly. So with that in mind, we have another question for you all. This time, do leaders on your campus see space management as a strategic priority? So if we're thinking about, those reports and kind of understanding who's using space, what is it enabling for us or blocking for us, it's really important to have campus leaders on board and understanding how important it can be strategically. So fewer options for this poll, so we'll give it another 60 seconds. But again, feel free to pop in the chat if you have thoughts on what you've seen on your campus about, is this a strategic priority, why or why not? Love to hear from everyone in the chat as well. All right, awesome. And yes is the runaway winner in this case with 9 out of 13 votes, which is awesome and encouraging to hear. I think, as you all probably know, and as you can hear from how we're discussing this, we're definitely seeing space management become a bigger and bigger priority. Maybe we'd hope that there's 100% yes, but we'll talk about ways to kind of bring campus leaders on board for cases where it's no or unsure with regards to how campus leaders are thinking about space management.
Definitely, I agree. I think this is pretty promising, actually, that 70% of folks selected yes here. So perhaps some of you are ahead of the curve here, but I definitely think, especially with the pandemic and folks returning to campus, that perhaps kind of helped push folks in the right direction in terms of seeing, yes, space is super critical to what we do here. So really, really glad to see this. And excited for how you can help perhaps bring folks on board, which we'll get to in the next slide here.
Yeah, and Bridget, just to pause real quick, Michael had a question in the Q&A, so I can just read this out and tackle it. And Michael was asking, going back to the reports, does CourseDog track sections that are being overscheduled such that enrollment is split and space usage becomes less efficient? Absolutely, great question. We'll talk a little bit more about kind of how CourseDog works as a whole later here, but definitely what we'll be able to do is track your section enrollment, provide some analytics and some guidance on which sections are over enrolled and under enrolled, not only with an eye to actually making your academic schedule function and making sure that there's instructors for every course, but trying to make sure that sections of 15 live in rooms with 20 seats and sections of 300 are scheduled in those rooms so we can make the most use of space and make sure that sections are in places where they make sense and courses are in sections that are most effective for that style of teaching and that type of course as well. So we definitely handle things like that, Michael. Cool. Awesome. Jumping ahead here to something we discussed a little bit earlier, which is making the case for investing in space. And like Bridget had mentioned, we want to share a couple of frameworks here for helping leadership understand that strategic importance of space. And it sounds like on a lot of your campuses already, folks are already on board. But who knows, there might be a time in the next year where we need to add some more space or start thinking about space differently. So this might be a useful framework for keeping everyone invested in space management and the importance of space management as well. So we'll start with kind of this first example here. You'll see the 3 columns: collecting information, making ask, and highlighting the outcomes. So when we're thinking about the types of space, the amenities, the resources, the room attributes required, and who is requesting those spaces, that ask is usually around investing in upgrading spaces. And some of the outcomes that we see folks think about here are increased student engagement and reducing the underutilization of specific rooms. If we have 10 rooms on campus that have a projector, and that tends to be a really common resource, and 20 rooms on campus that don't have a projector, there's just going to be an obvious gap with underutilized rooms. So maybe a small investment in some technology for those spaces can make a huge impact on the number of students who can actually attend events and on making the best use of spaces that we already have. So sometimes maybe a small investment in some tech there can really help with a high level strategic outcome. Jumping down to the second column with room utilization metrics, and again, who is requesting the space, can we set up policies to encourage room centralization with an eye towards, again, reducing underutilized rooms and decreasing the need for net new space? Sometimes it's easy to maybe jump to, oh, we need to build a new building or add on to this existing building or split a room into 2 rooms or combine rooms. But if there are ways that we can be smarter about room centralization or being more efficient with bookings, it might be easier to get stakeholders on board for an investment in that sort of process than in needing to somehow create net new space. And jumping down to our third row here, with revenue from renting out space, the ask there is usually around how are we going to promote space rentals? Are we going to have a marketing budget? Are we going to redesign our site to encourage outside space rentals? We've had some institutions ask us, like, we've thought about building an Airbnb for space rentals on campus. So there's definitely a lot of interest in this area. And it's really about investing in the tools and the infrastructure to actually manage that. You think about something like a wedding on campus, that is a huge undertaking. So you really have to have really great tools in place before you can do that. But the outcomes there are going to be increased revenue, engagement with the community, and a connection with future applicants as well. So all of these things, can can be a little bit more cyclical than they might appear at first. So we host more events on campus, just increasing visibility, doing some of the marketing, just via the event, and hopefully increasing that revenue as well. So those are just a couple of examples, but this is a kind of a framework that we found really helpful when making an ask, trying to think about the really high level outcomes that will make sense to stakeholders on campus and helping them think through why this ask makes sense. And then we can also touch here on the different types of rental opportunities that we have. And this is just a chance to highlight all the stuff that can actually be done on campus. It might not seem obvious at first, but there's a lot of shorter term uses and then some longer term uses that can take place as well. So short-term space, we're highlighting here things like meetings, sporting events, music recitals, concerts, weddings, graduations, kind of those one-off opportunities, and especially opportunities that require some bigger spaces that campuses might have, but they might be in short supply elsewhere nearby. And then some longer term uses, especially during the summer or longer breaks or off seasons for campus, are things like conferences, retreats, summer camps, sports camps, workshops, youth academic programs. And sometimes these might include longer term stays for folks, bringing our dorms into event management and things like that, but really trying to make use of space in kind of some of those longer periods where there might be fewer academic events and just fewer people on campus in general. So one more poll coming up here. Are external space rentals an important revenue initiative for your campus? We'd love to hear from everyone on that. Again, give it about 60 seconds and feel free to comment in the chat, or if you have another question, post that there as well.
Awesome. We can probably give this about another 10 seconds or so, and then we'll go ahead and close the poll and share it for you all to see.
Awesome. Interesting. Pretty good mix here with yes at 40, yes, we want to do more at 30, and no, but we hope to expand our efforts at 20, and no at 10%. So pretty good mix. Yeah, again, I think definitely a growing space of interest. And we think about this as kind of 90% of the group here interested at least in doing more for external space rentals. So it's definitely a really important area for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. Pretty fascinating to see that. Yeah, about 90% are either in the bucket of doing it or hoping to expand more, which we are going to touch on in this final slide here before we get into our Q&A and give you all a chance to ask some more questions.
Yeah, so thinking about those external space rentals, one of the big questions that we'll often hear from folks is, we're interested in doing this, but how can we do it? And also, how can we do it maybe without buying a billboard or something? How can we do this with kind of the tools we have at our disposal right now? And one great tactic is enhancing your web presence. So making sure that the event site that you're using is very usable with high quality pictures of spaces, good descriptions of spaces, sample floor plans, a clear list of all of the amenities and equipment that's available. We don't want folks thinking that, even maybe a small resource isn't there, and so they're kind of scared off of actually pursuing a request. And then testimonials and calls to action can be great as well, especially if this is a newer initiative, finding folks that have actually used Campus Space before and getting their input that you can use on the site can be really helpful as well, just to make folks feel comfortable requesting and booking some space with you. And then in that middle column here, partnering with local organizations, whether it's the Chamber of Commerce, the Tourism Bureau, community interest groups, any sort of local group that is either likely to need space on a consistent basis, or who is out there in the community hearing from folks looking to bring kind of more business into the area, might be a great group to help get the word out that your institution is really interested in supporting people and having them come in and use the space you have available. And then streamlining the rental process is really important as well. I'm sure we've all been on a site where we're looking to make a purchase and something doesn't work, or we can't get all the information we need, or it seems like kind of an archaic process to actually make a purchase. That can be really disappointing and a big disincentive to actually follow through. So as streamlined as possible, so we can make the rental process is really great. So starting with a really smooth experience just on the site itself, to self-serve options online, to putting all of the rental steps into that one site, from the reservation to the contract to the payment, can be really helpful. So we're not sending folks to different places and having them get frustrated with the process. And then putting all of the information in one place. Again, going back to making the site really amazing and easy to use, making sure that on that site, in the reservation process, folks get all of the information they need, know who to contact, and understand the process. Makes it way easier to follow through and actually complete a request and go through with a reservation. So those are kind of the three buckets we focus on when helping people think about reaching new audiences with external rentals. And if anyone else has interesting tactics, also feel free to throw them in the chat. And we have a question from Christina, who's asking, do you take payments now for rentals? Last I heard, that was not something you currently offer. Christina, you are correct. Last you heard, we didn't handle that, but we will very, very soon. We're going to begin supporting online payment processing, kind of integrated into our invoicing. Don't have a super firm ETA for you on that, but definitely within the next 2 quarters, next 5 or 6 months, we'll be able to support that and kind of make it that end-to-end process for reservation, invoice, payment, everything kind of in one place. Awesome question. Thank you for asking that one. And yeah, don't think we have anything else in the chat or any other questions. So yeah, we've covered a bunch. Thank you everyone for kind of listening to some of the best practices and some of the ideas we had to share with you all, and for participating in the chat and in those polls. And I just wanted to touch quickly on kind of what we do at CourseDog and how we can help institutions achieve some of these goals and actually deliver on these best practices. Basically at CourseDog, we are an all-in-one academic operations tool, really interested in helping everyone meet their institutional goals. And on the events and space management side of things, we try to bring everything into one place. Your academic scheduling and your events management is integrated, no more double bookings. Everything can go through the same tool. Your users will be really familiar with CourseDog because we'll be using it for a lot of different use cases. And it just brings everything into one place and is extremely flexible and user-centric. And we can configure a lot of different things to meet your needs. Makes it really easy on end users, whether it's students or event requesters. And we just try to consolidate all of those platforms for you, like we touched on across this session, and give one single source of truth for academic and event scheduling. So that's really what we do here at CourseDog. And Bridget, unless you have anything to add, I think we'll open it up to Q&A here.
No, I think that's great. Yeah, thanks for that overview, Brian. I know that We've addressed several of your questions throughout this presentation. Brian's done a great job at answering those, but feel free to go take to the Q&A function or the chat, and we're happy to answer any questions that you all have for us. So we'll give everyone a couple of seconds to type in any questions that they may have to the Q&A function. Brian, one question that I'm seeing here, this person is wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what a central calendar within CourseDog looks like, for both those academic and non-academic events that might be going on. How do folks use that internally at an institution versus students who might be seeing it externally?
Yeah, definitely. So what we do in CourseDog is kind of provide an internal calendar and an external calendar. The internal calendar is really flexible. You can use a bunch of different save views and filters and really narrow it down to an individual day view or a month-long view and see kind of a big picture, as high level of a picture of your events as you would like to see. And then we also provide a public calendar for folks to see all of the events happening on campus and also to request events from that same site. So it'll be a kind of a public calendar that will match your institutional branding. It'll be a really great place for your current students to go in and view and current folks in the community to go in and view what events are upcoming. And then it kind of integrates with the event request process as well. So we try to have an internal view that matches an external view that also serves as kind of a jumping off point for requests. So trying to bring all three of those functions into one place. I hope that answered the question. So if anyone wants to follow up on that one, definitely feel free. And we have a question in Q&A. Oh, and Christina also just mentioned in the chat, American Express. Yes, definitely kind of what we build for payment processing will have a lot of different options for payment types, and then definitely would be able to handle all sort of major credit card brands like American Express. And then Michael's wondering, how does the room scheduling work in CourseDog? So Michael, maybe just follow up in the chat here. I imagine you're asking about maybe academic scheduling here, but follow up if you're just wondering about how like a room request for an event would work, or if you're thinking more courses and section level scheduling. Happy to answer both or one of those, depending on what you're interested in. And academic room scheduling. Yeah, so Michael, that's a big topic. We can definitely follow up with lots of documentation and how that works. That is kind of a separate process from event scheduling, and that doesn't really work on a request flow. It's kind of a scheduled building flow that would happen internally. So we'll follow up with some documentation and happy to answer any questions you have there. But we could talk for a long time about everything we can do with academic scheduling for sure. Any other questions? Doesn't have to be on events. Any other CourseDog questions or anything we can answer?
Well, we'll give folks a few more seconds to enter any other questions they may have in the chat here. But otherwise, I think we can probably begin wrapping up. We have one final question for you all here, just to give you an opportunity to express interest if you are interested in learning more about how we can support you all. Won't be sharing the poll results, just kind of for our own internal use. So if you want to just go ahead and select yes or no, and then I think we can go and wrap things up. All right, well, thank you to everyone who has selected their answer here. We'll leave this up for a little bit longer if you haven't had a chance to yet. But thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. Brian and I think, really enjoyed this discussion, really loved seeing how you all, approach space management and events on your campus, and hope you can enjoy these few minutes back in your day, go grab a snack, maybe take a short walk before your next meeting.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.